The Crisis of Modernity. There are many things which could be called a crisis in the modern world. War, famine, disease, declining birth rates, changing climates, political and social upheaval. All these are occurring, just as things like them have always occurred, and perhaps always will. These are not the crisis of modernity. Modernity itself, as a force, is in and of itself a crisis. Modernity, and all that rests upon it, shall come crashing down, as we have already seen the signs of. Yet, I do not intend to doom-monger, for while much of this may seem bleak, there is also much to be excited about. There are some who deny the crisis of modernity, but the subject is becoming ever more mainstream as time goes on. I will present my own take on it, as so many have before me, and I think it is long past time I addressed it directly on my channel. The Church of the Machine can provide a perspective on modernity which, while perhaps not entirely original, should nonetheless be unique enough to foster new ideas and give you a new perspective on the world we find ourselves in today. This is an immense subject, and one which will ultimately require more than one video, but whether you are new to this project or not, I trust that this video will make sense in isolation. Today I will discuss simply what modernity is, why it is a crisis, what I think that it will result in, and how we can ultimately move forward out of it into greater things than we have ever seen before. Welcome to the Church of the Machine. My mission is to found a new religion. Let us begin. What is modernity? With this question I am asking more than one thing. First, I want to state that in the most bland of terms, I'm not simply talking about the world that exists right here and now, although yes, that is included. Nor do I limit this to a discussion of the world in recent years, or even within living memory. I am referring to modernity in the historical sense, the modern world, in the sense of being distinct from the ancient and medieval worlds, which would have begun sometime around the 16th century. All of this is considered modern by historians, although it is further subdivided into the early modern period, the modern period, and contemporary history. Broadly speaking, early modern history began around the time of the Protestant Reformation, while the truly modern era began with the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. That answers what the modern world is in the most simplistic sense, yet it does not tell you why modernity could be considered a crisis. To be sure, there are many problems: resource shortages, economic decline, infertility, environmental degradation, war, famine, disease, and more. But none of these are themselves the crisis of modernity. Rather, I think that the nature of our crisis is best characterized as a spiritual crisis, or more precisely, lack of meaning. It is the soulless feeling of modernity, the soul-crushing monotony of it, the lack of meaning, lack of life, lack of hope, which is truly the source of this decay. Spiritual crisis can be a somewhat vague and ill-defined term, and so its usefulness is limited. Clearly, though, there is something which the modern world lacks which prior civilizations did not lack. What is this? Why is it that even at the height of our material and economic success, when life is relatively comfortable and easy, that we enter into a crisis of meaning? Is it simply that we were too busy, occupied with basic survival, to deeply ponder the meaning of it all beforehand? I don't think so. Rather, I think that these questions have always been there, but that in the past we were able to answer them in a satisfying way, and now we cannot. The modern world fundamentally suffers from a lack of meaning, in a way which prior civilizations never did. We have made changes, not only to our ways of life, but to our fundamental ways of conceptualizing the world and reality, and our place within it. which have undermined the prior sources of meaning. We cannot return, we cannot undo what has been done, but I think it is long past the point of needing to address this lack of meaning, and find something genuinely fulfilling to fill that void. Many great thinkers and philosophers have, over the decades, presented their own takes on this crisis, and what we can do about it. But the greatest of them all, I think, was Friedrich Nietzsche. Those who watch the channel regularly at all will know that I am greatly fond of him, and I think the terminology he used and the way he described the crisis was perhaps the most apt and fruitful, and will serve as a good basis for me to present my own thoughts. I want to put things into his terms, the way he was able to express it, and that was to call it the death of God. One cannot reconcile God as he was with the world as it now is. The two are incompatible, alien to one another. God used to be something people spoke of in the most blatant and literal of terms, and it was likewise with demons and other things. Now these things are spoken of mostly metaphorically, or in the abstract at best, but never are we so compelled to do things in the name of God as our ancestors were. In the name of God, our ancestors could put together a crusade out of nothing, and sustain a campaign on the edge of the known world. Now he would struggle to get a bill passed in the name of God. This is not simply because a smaller number of people profess belief in a religion than have done previously. It is far more extensive than that. It is that even those who would profess belief, those who would cling so unwaveringly to their faith, still cannot give their full heart to it. That is because God, fundamentally, is no longer believable. Not just God, but the entire basis of all understanding hitherto. Perhaps the number of believers has not fallen that much yet, but the nature of the belief which is held has been radically transformed. Whatever affirmations people may say they hold, their actions speak louder than their words. This is the nature of our crisis. It is that fundamentally, without God, and without anything else taken as seriously as God once was, we have no basis for anything anymore. So, God, as an idea, has ceased to be believable, at least if you accept the teachings of Nietzsche. I believe that he provided the correct diagnosis, and the solutions he explored, while not necessarily sufficient, certainly provide fertile ground for future peoples to extrapolate from. Whether more people will profess belief is not what ultimately matters for the death of God, because even those who claim to be the most devout are now only capable of lying to themselves. The issue is the simultaneous necessity and impossibility of God. How people will react to this is impossible to know with certainty at this time, but I have a few ideas. I think as the death of God becomes more realized, and the sense of melancholy and mourning continues to take root, it will become increasingly necessary for individuals to forge their own paths, new paths, which will take them to new places not walked before. The thing is, it isn't just that God has died. This is a fundamentally Western phrasing of something which I feel is more universal. One might say that the very idea of universal truth itself is dead. In ages prior, an organization such as the Catholic Church might have claimed to hold on to some objective, universal, undisputed absolute truth of things. Yet now it seems that all is up for debate, and nothing is beyond question. If there were one thing which the death of truth can be abstracted to, it is the loss of faith in a superworld. The superworld is an idea, or more accurately a broad umbrella term for a whole myriad of disparate and often unrelated ideas, concerning a world which is in some way higher than our own. Examples include heaven, paradise, a world of forms, the thing in itself, a spirit world, certain conceptions of enlightenment, Brahman, and more. These are notions from all of time and space, and many of them have emerged independently from one another, so it is impossible to claim that they are all truly the same idea. But they all share in making a fundamental distinction between a lower reality we are bound to, and a higher reality which we cannot access. And this distinction lies at the very core of almost all religions and belief systems which have guided mankind henceforth. Yet it seems now we have ceased to make this distinction, at least in the way that we used to. Modern science accepts only material explanations of things, and this materialism has found its way to seep into every aspect of our beliefs and culture, arguably much to our detriment. Nonetheless, it is not so easily dismissed as one might hope. It is true that materialism is a model of the universe which can accurately explain many things. The handful of things which it does not explain, such as what consciousness is, or why there is something rather than nothing, are often dismissed as somewhat vapid. Nietzsche was perhaps the greatest critic of the superworld, yet his criticism was far removed from that of later atheists. Some might say that the death of God has occurred because the natural sciences have been able to accurately explain all the things which were previously ascribed to God. But although this has no doubt contributed to the diminishing of faith and belief in the modern world, it is not at all the only factor at play, and not the one Nietzsche believed to be the most important. Nietzsche's argument against belief in the superworld was not one based on material sciences, but on psychology. He asked what kind of person would believe in a superworld, and the answer he came to was that only one who found the world lacking, devoid of meaning, or was in some way repulsed by the world presented to the senses, would feel the need for a superworld. In a way, there has never truly been any material proof or disproof of worlds beyond our own, nor has any truly overwhelming logical argument ever been made for or against. It is a belief which forms for psychological reasons more so than rational ones. Nietzsche's argument was that only a psyche which felt incomplete would find belief in a superworld appealing or believable, and that it was therefore not a belief formed from a healthy psyche, but from one which was in some way deficient. I think perhaps the reasons for the death of God have to do with the psychological ramifications of things which have occurred in centuries past. There has been a great paradigm shift in what the senses are capable of uncovering by means of the natural sciences. It is less that we use the natural sciences to find evidence against God, as it was that the very act of using the natural sciences in this way, and how surprisingly and radically it altered our understanding of the world, fundamentally undermined any notion that the world of the senses was somehow deficient of a greater coherence, of the kind which previously would have been sought in a superworld. Thus it is a psychological awakening, an acceptance of the world as it is, which is perhaps the true cause of the death of God. The full ramifications of the death of God have yet to be felt. It is a testament to Nietzsche's foresight that he was able to predict all of this more than a century ago. Nonetheless, I think much of it is plain to see for anyone who understands enough about these ideas to watch thus far. It is a psychological awakening. We have not gained any new knowledge regarding superworlds, but we have learned a great deal about the material world through the natural sciences, and we have gained great power as a result. We have therefore learned that we are capable of doing this, of understanding the world by analysing it and experimenting. And in some ways that represents a death of a prior method of understanding, the kind which would have been used by Plato and those before him. That of pure reason and logic. The ancient Greeks never developed science, and the idea would have seemed largely alien to them. Fundamentally, they did not trust their senses, and believed that only reason alone could make sound judgment. This was how they could believe for centuries that heavier objects would fall faster, even though a simple experiment can disprove this, because it never occurred to them to actually make such experiments. The disregard of the material world has now become untenable, both rationally and psychologically. No longer can we live abstractly in fortresses of our own reason, our own essentially imaginary creation. The elaborate philosophical worldviews constructed by those like Plato, which much theology can be grouped in with, no longer seem so sensible as they once did. It is now, fundamentally, that the most concrete and baseline reality must be confronted head-on, and that is a pain which not all will have the tolerance for. That is the nature of our crisis. With the death of God, along with it the death of all abstract absolute truths, which were based on the reason dictated by prior philosophers and theologians, people have sought new sources of meaning. An example which occurred not too long after Nietzsche's death was that of the First World War. There are many complex historical factors as to why the First World War happened, and why it was so bloody and horrible, but I think one which much of it could be attributed to is this. Nationalism had become a source of meaning for people's lives. Europe at the time had just gone through some of the most radical changes in human history with the Industrial Revolution and the expansion of colonialism, having technologically and militarily overwhelmed every other civilization on Earth, civilizations which, in prior ages, had been far stronger and far more powerful than Europe, and even threatened it in many ways. This led to an immense arrogance across all European nations, as even the relatively small and minor powers now had world-spanning empires, in some ways greater than even Rome. Perhaps that arrogance would not have led to such bloodshed, but the thing which let it foster untempered was that nationalism had begun to replace religion as the primary source of meaning for people. This happened almost imperceptibly, as faith and fatherland were tied together in marriage. But nonetheless, no one could deny that people had become as emphatic and cult-like around their nationhood as they had once been around God. The nation was in this time what the Catholic Church had been in ages prior. With nationalism, though, everyone has a different nation which they rally behind, and when all of those nations live in such close proximity to one another, all believe themselves to be the strongest and most unstoppable force in nature, and all have access to the most destructive and powerful weapons ever developed, it is not at all hard to see how inevitable a bloodbath becomes. Nations like Britain and Germany, which not long before had regarded one another as brother, began to savagely fear one another, and eventually tear one another to pieces. For the First World War it was nationalism and imperialism. By the Second World War this had evolved into a wide number of ideologies, which tore at one another just as destructively. It is easy to point to the bloodshed of the world wars, at the arrogance of the intellectual classes of the time being pro-war, but the most horrifying aspects of human nature which were brought to bear, and the great evils which were committed during this time. But are we really any wiser now than we were then? I think, in many ways, we are not. We are not wiser. We are only more fearful. More hesitant to lash out in pride. More likely to retreat into the quiet submission, the slow death. In some ways, this can ironically be likened to early Christianity. Early on, this religion existed during a time of spiritual crisis, in which faith in the old religion of Rome had grown much weaker, for reasons outside the scope of this video and my historical knowledge. Yet I bring it this time, because it was one in which Christianity was something wholly alien to what it has become since. There was no true Christianity, so much as there were an uncountable number of disparate and distinct groups, each with their own beliefs and their own take on things. Each of them followed a different account of things, and it took a long time before a coherent religion formed out of it. The irony is that we are now likely to return to this time. The Protestant Reformation saw the creation of countless new sects of Christianity, but now things like Mormonism have sprung up, which are essentially made-up new twists on Christianity. Never again shall there be a monopoly on faith. I use Christianity as an example, but I think much of religion will follow this trend. There are examples of religions such as Shintoism, which are inherently nationalistic in nature, but these do not claim to hold a universal truth which all must ascribe to, and and as such the death of God is in some ways less impactful to them. These faiths may change, but I think they are likely to continue on. The thing is that other faiths, which previously claimed a universal monopoly on truth, will likely mutate until they diversify into similar forms of this. Each one will be particular to a given region, a given people, a given ideology, a given tribe, a given cult. But that is all. Of course, not everyone will follow these sorts of nation faiths, be they novel or simply a reshuffling of the old. Many people will be looking for alternative sources of meaning, but most are settling for the conformity of creature comforts, satisfied to simply exist, and essentially just watch TV. Many people live on a level where they simply do not ponder the meaning of life, and these people will perhaps be the most miserable of all. Yet besides the lack of meaning and the dissolution of religion, the spiritual crisis takes on another form. It is also a moral crisis, which is to say, it is a crisis of moral teaching and understanding. With the death of God, and the death of higher reality, there is also a death of any basis for absolute moral claims. Morality becomes something which is treated as arbitrary, subjective, and in many ways becomes much easier to ignore. That is a factor which will exacerbate the damage of the crisis, as many more atrocities and greatly immoral deeds will be carried out as a result. I think the irony is that in some ways this is actually a return to a more ancient understanding of morality. The idea of morality as a universal absolute truth is not truly the original form of it, and in many ways I think it is an invention which came alongside the proliferation of the monotheistic Abrahamic faiths. Prior to this, morality was in some ways an extension of manners and customs, which is to say it set out the common understanding of acceptable and unacceptable behaviours for members of a society to adhere to. Inherent to that is the particularization of morality to a given society and culture. It is not treated as something universal, which must be applied to all people everywhere, but rather there are different moral understandings, norms, and customs when dealing with different peoples and different cases. This is not to say morality was a matter of opinion, as it seems to be today, but it was a matter of having different rules on a case-by-case basis. The rules were internal, unique to the group, and were not applied evenly outside that group. I think we will see a return to this, following the death of higher morality alongside the death of God. Morals will not be applied universally, but instead each group will treat their own members with a higher moral respect than they will to others, in particular to competing groups. It is not at all hard to see how this could lead to horrifying things occurring. It is a dangerous idea that morality is not universal in this way, but in some ways its dangerousness is also its greatest merit. This is our spiritual crisis. In the absence of any higher spiritual authority, countless groups are filling the void. In the First World War it might simply have been nationalism, but now it is challenging to even label the various groups or keep track of them. These issues compound upon themselves, and in the end the problems become impossible to ignore. The spiritual problems have wider implications for culture, for society, for civilization itself. It is inevitable that a spiritual crisis should manifest as a civilisational one. I already mentioned the First World War as an example, but that was small fry compared to what it might ultimately lead to. There is almost no way to overstate the significance of this. A crisis of meaning, of truth, of reality itself, is plaguing our civilization. There is a reason new wars are breaking out throughout the world. There is a reason why the economy is failing. There is a reason why politics is becoming ever more absurd and ridiculous. There is a reason why governments are becoming more controlling, and why human freedom is dying. There is a reason why so many choose to commit suicide rather than face modernity. Contrary to the beliefs of some, the world has in many ways been getting worse in recent years, and the entire notion of progress, as it was once understood, has begun to crumble. This was one of the defining pillars of modern civilization, and there was a long time for which it seemed true. Yet as time has gone on, more and more people have begun to wonder what we are really progressing towards, and whether it is really so desirable. I spoke earlier about what truly defined modern history in an academic sense. Most broadly, the time since the Protestant Reformation, but most especially the time since the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, is what we would truly consider to be modern civilization. Modern civilization is, in many ways, arguably an entirely different and distinct form of civilization than what existed prior to it. In some ways, we are as distinct today from historical medieval society as medieval society was from Rome. Modern civilization is distinct in many ways, and was founded on its own set of tenets and on its own axioms. Among the principles which define modern civilization, progress remains a cornerstone, and is not the only cornerstone which has begun to crumble. There are many aspects of the modernistic worldview, a worldview which defines every major political, societal, economic, and cultural movement which has held sway over humanity in the past few centuries, which are built on lies. The entire system collapses like a house of cards when these lies are uncovered, as they now have been, and the great experiment of modern civilization must now draw its grim conclusion. War. War is what this will inevitably lead to. It is simply the case that when there are no universal axioms, even no such thing as universal truth, everyone will find new truths to believe in. The political divide which spans modern civilization goes far deeper than just right and left. It isn't just that people disagree on things like how the economy should be run or who should sit in political office. It is that the most fundamental aspects of reality itself are now a political issue. Politics is where a lot of this conflict manifests, because it is in many ways the religion of modern civilization. I think one of the chief characteristics of modernity is its form of utilitarianism, wherein natural philosophy, in the form of science, takes precedent over other forms of philosophy, because it directly concerns the world we live in. Political philosophy is something of an exception to this. Without a superworld to believe in, without a heavenly king, the worldly king seems far more important, and thus begins a worship of politics. I think ultimately the various ideas and rational justifications people make as to why their political ideology needs to win are fallacious. And what it really boils down to is still tribalism. Most people are just looking for someone from their tribe, their cult, to win power. That is true of both the right and the left, and of every major subculture in modern society. Like I say, we will see more nationalistic religions, though one might equally substitute the word tribalistic to avoid connotations of nationalism as a political ideology. And in the West, at least, I think politics has become the main form of this. Democracy kind of incentivizes that, by its nature. It makes politics the religion of the masses. Yet democracy can only work if there are tenets which are upheld, and a wider respect for the overall system and greater values of the society are accepted. You cannot use democracy to resolve a dispute of reality itself. The moment that one side, or the other, refuses to accept the results of the democratic system, that is no longer democracy. That is a civil war. History is no stranger to war and crisis, and the future is unlikely to differ much. Indeed, crises have occurred at somewhat regular intervals throughout human history. There are usually major wars every human lifetime or so, separated by longer periods of relative peace. I am not one to subscribe to notions that history is cyclical, and we are doomed to repeat ourselves, but we cannot deny that humans are creatures of habit, for better or worse. All of this is to say, I think the great struggle of the modern crisis, fundamentally, inevitably, will come down to violence. violence may well decide the fate of mankind, as it has done so many times before. I do not advocate that we immediately take up arms and seek the destruction of all groups besides our own. I do, however, warn of the immense danger of being unprepared for what is to come. I do not think civilization will collapse, but a civilisational crisis, one in which many fundamental aspects of civilization, including things like birth rate, infrastructure, economic opportunities, political stability, and law and order, all come crashing down, does not seem out of the question. Crime rates have been rising across the developed world. Many wealthy cities now have large regions which are considered unsafe. Political and ideological violence seems more and more common with time. Who can deny that all of this will reach a breaking point, sooner or later? There is no nation in the developed world which truly serves its own interests. That is because one of the most fundamental responses to this crisis has been that of self-destruction. The higher world, the superworld, once seen as a sacred justification for all worldly civilization, has been undermined, and thus all such worldly civilizations have too been undermined. All that is left is self-hatred, self-loathing, self-destruction. We poison ourselves. Suicide is a common enough response to these circumstances, both for individuals and collective organizations. In a way, we could view this crisis as an entire culture committing suicide. I want to confront this tendency, this suicidal tendency of our culture, because someone has to. Indeed, many people are trying to, in various ways, and I believe I can confront it in ways which others cannot. Contrary to what one might assume, I do not think this crisis is as bad as some have made it out to be. In fact, I think there will be found a natural resolution in the times ahead, and one which will raise humanity, or what might be called humanity, to new heights which have never before been seen. Why is modern civilization so self-destructive? If you look at any modern, developed country, and you look at the various groups which constitute society, invariably, almost every single one of them portrays itself as countercultural, as opposition to the establishment. And this is even true of the establishment itself. Those on the left may see themselves as fighting against the patriarchy, or the bourgeoisie, or capitalism, while those on the right might see themselves as fighting against the radical feminists, socialists, neoliberal world order, or established democratic system. No one is really fighting to preserve the world as it is. Everyone is seemingly fighting as hard as they possibly can to change things. Even the most powerful groups who run the world are championing new ideas and ideologies, often rather dystopian ones. But it seems that even they are not happy with the world as it is. This is endemic of a society which is on course for collapse. No one within the existing system is happy with it. No one really sees modernity as a good thing anymore. Everyone is discontent and dissatisfied in some way. Why is this? It is not simply that modernity exists in the absence and decline of traditional sources of meaning and value. It is that modernity has made every active effort to destroy any remnant of what these things were. Think about it. What are the things most despised in modern society? The things which, if you affirm the value of, will lead you to being considered dangerous, irrational, or evil. Things like glory, power, order, traditional gender roles, nationalism, religiosity, art, and culture. These were once the cornerstones of civilization. They might not have been perfect, but they provided commonly held values which could hold society together. The affirmation of these things allowed for stability, and in that stability it was possible for some form of progress to occur. Yet now, not only have all of these things been undermined, but it seems that the values which have come to replace them are founded precisely on the principle of self-destruction. It is this principle of self-destruction which I consider the deepest founding ideology of modernity. The things which are espoused as virtues in the world today are equality, democracy, rational argument over intuition or tradition. Instead of serving one's own tribe, nation, or in-group, one is expected to be generous most of all to outsiders. What is alien is good, and what is native is bad. These values are taken as the dogmatic religion which modernity adheres to. How did this come to be the case? It seems insane that those within a society, most especially those within the elite, in whose interest it would surely be to maintain at least some level of orderliness, focus so obsessively on the destruction of everything which maintains social cohesion. Yet this is precisely what modernity is: insanity. Modernity believes that rationality is supreme above all, and that there is nothing which cannot be explained and articulated through words, categorization, and spreadsheet logic. Everything has to be done in a formalized test. Everything can be understood entirely as numbers and statistics. If something cannot be scientifically tested, or does not have peer-reviewed academic papers, it is seen as worthless, or without any objective value. Art and culture are seen as superficial and arbitrary, no greater than the sum of their entertaining or pleasing qualities. It is believed that humans are omnipotent, and that human nature is fundamentally reasonable and perfectible. That reality itself can be bent to our whim, and that we can change anything about the world without any real consequences, and that we are not ultimately accountable to anything higher than ourselves. We believe that, given sufficient time, human effort, and industry, a utopian world can be created, some kind of technological golden age, in which we shall all live peacefully, act as rational agents, and achieve total supremacy over the material world. All of this is a fallacy. An individual who believed he was able to achieve complete power over reality, was not accountable to anyone or anything, and that he was destined to rule the world and create a utopia, would be considered insane. Yet an entire culture, an entire civilization which believes this, is called modernity. Why is modernity so self-destructive? Because it believes it has no roots. It believes itself to be objective and rational, and that it would be able to exist in a stable form without any basis in history, religion, or mysticism. It sees these things as threats to itself, by its very nature. It views all of these values, which are contrary to its own pursuit of rationalism and progress, to be antiquated, superstitious, or evil, and seeks to tear them down. Everyone is trying to create some kind of revolution, or overthrow the establishment, because modernity teaches us that we are not accountable to any higher powers. The human being is supreme, and that utopia can be made by human hands. It is this insanity which is leading us to ruin, to the crisis of modernity. Modernity was born in the Protestant Reformation, later exacerbated in the American and especially the French Revolution. Both of the latter revolutions framed their narrative around a band of oppressed but righteous rebels, overthrowing an established monarchical regime and establishing a republic based on their own ideas about how things should be run. The Protestant Reformation was similar, although along religious lines, rather than political ones. This type of rebellious, revolutionary sentiment is inherent to the fundamental mythology of modern culture. It is seen in media such as Star Wars, The Hunger Games, and many other examples. These stories idolize the little people, the oppressed, the victims, the downtrodden, and the weak. Those who are rebellious, revolutionary, and seek to overthrow the established unjust order and replace it with something righteous. In these various pieces of media, the established order is often viewed as something inherently inhuman, sometimes something excessively analytical and rationalist in its ways of operating. In Star Wars it is the Empire, but another good example is the Matrix, in which the world is ruled over by the machines. It is ironic that this is exactly what modernity has become. History since the beginning of modernity could be viewed as a series of iterative stages, wherein an established regime is overthrown by a countercultural and anti-establishment ideology, which destroys the prior establishment in the name of justice. It then establishes its own regime, which which is often even more unjust than the previous one, only for the cycle to repeat itself anew. Germany was once a region of countless microstates with unique cultures and aesthetics. Then the Prussians rebelled against the chaos and established the German Empire. Then those within the German Empire wanted to rebel against the established world order and started the First World War. Then the Allied powers rebelled against Germany and established the Weimar Republic. Then a certain Austrian painter rebelled against the Weimar Republic and established his own ideology. Then that ideology rebelled against the outside world again. Then the world rebelled against that ideology. Then half of Germany was ruled over by communism. Then people started to rebel against communism. If you think this cycle is unique to Germany, or that it has now come to an end, then you simply have not been paying attention. As I said, still to this day, every major societal subculture views itself as countercultural. Every ideological or political group views itself as anti-establishment. This is no coincidence. It is fundamental to the way that modern thinking operates. It would be deeply ironic for me, then, to advocate against this established pattern of modernistic thinking. To say, let us overthrow this unjust cyclical pattern of revolution and suffering. That would be a great irony indeed. No, I'm not advocating anything at all just yet. I'm simply making observations. Modernity is apocalyptic. I mean that in every sense of the word. This principle of self-destruction and the idealization of the revolutionary is something which has caused untold suffering over the past few centuries, and to a far greater extent than things which existed prior. It is apocalyptic in the sense of being world-ending. Indeed, the world as we know it has been destroyed many times because of modernity, and I have no doubt that it will again be destroyed. Yet modernity is, ultimately, also apocalyptic in the original sense of the word, which is to say, revelatory. Modernity, for all its faults, all its fallacies, for all its insanity, is built upon a revelation. It is not because this revelation is false, but precisely because it is true, that this revelation is so maddening. One Howard Phillips Lovecraft may have been onto something here. I believe that for all that is wrong with the modern world, for all the suffering and destruction which it has wrought, it is ultimately a necessary stage in the development of human civilization and of life on Earth. It is neither possible nor even truly desirable to revert to a prior way of being. Indeed, that notion is fundamentally contrary to the nature of being. Rather, I think that, in another great irony, the only way to overcome the crisis of modernity is to further extrapolate the crisis of modernity. We are living through an apocalypse, which is to say, a revelation. This revelation has been tremendously destructive in its consequences, and has resulted in the procedural meltdown of all that we have held dear. Yet it is in the cocoon that the caterpillar liquefies, or melts down, and I think our modern world can also be likened to a cocoon. The truth about the crisis of modernity is that it is in fact not a crisis at all. In spite of everything that it may lead to, and all the misfortunes which it may involve, it is, ultimately, in a certain sense, liberation. It is a meltdown of what once was into ingredients from which new things can be made. Now is a time for architects, designers, and schemers to begin their work of planning ahead. New civilizations, even new forms of life itself, will ultimately come into being because of this time. It is for this reason that I have continued my work on the Church of the Machine until now. This project is in many ways my attempt to be one of these architects, designers, and schemers. The Church of the Machine represents my will to create, in the face of the darkness of the modern world. It is therefore my life's work to pursue this project, and bring it into fruition. But in many ways the problem is far too multifaceted to be tackled by one man alone. That is why I will need you, dear viewer, who has been kind enough to take an interest in this strange project. Regardless of where you are in your own philosophical or spiritual journey, it is important to perpetually consider the re-evaluation of values. The Church of the Machine is a re-evaluation, a reshuffling, and in my eyes it is the central pillar around which the crisis of modernity shall unfold. That may sound like a bold claim for such a relatively niche and unknown project, but if I am right, my words shall echo through the ages like the tolling of a church bell. The Church of the Machine, then, is my answer to the crisis of modernity. I imagine that many of you who have watched until now are already viewers of my channel and are well aware of the Church of the Machine, but I suspect that many of you also are not. I'll keep my introduction brief, as I have plenty of other content explaining various aspects of the Church of the Machine in more depth, including an introduction video, as well as an hour-long deep dive into the history of the Church. However, now I want to focus on how the Church of the Machine is influenced by, and how it responds to, the crisis of modernity. I have sometimes, in fact quite often, described the Church of the Machine as a new religion. This is a useful simplification because it is in some ways quite easy to understand without elaboration. But it is also fundamentally a description which is devoid of nuance, and which does not truly tell you anything about my goals, methods, or purposes. Religion is in some ways quite a nebulous term, as is the somewhat arbitrary categorization we use to distinguish a religion as something distinct from religion in other forms. Because of that, if I am completely honest, I do not see myself as a founder of a new religion, not in the way that Jesus or Muhammad or various other prophetic figures from history were. Rather, in some ways, I see myself as returning to what might be the oldest form of religion of mankind, that being machine worship. It would be natural to call this postulation absurd, but I trust you'll be willing to bear with me for a moment while I explain myself. I think machine worship in a certain sense is the original form of religion, because I am always referring to something deeper with the word machine than what modern rationalist and mechanistic conceptions would comprehend. Machine, in the original root of the word, means power, or that which is powerful. I have gone deeper into the etymology and true meaning behind that in the past, but the important thing to understand is that there is a lot more to the machine than simply material contraptions created for utilitarian ends. Machine worship is in many ways a worship of, which is to say to derive your source of meaning from, power itself. Consider what the earliest forms of religion actually were. Animism, ancient ritual, fire worship. The ancient Zoroastrians and the myths of Prometheus were prime examples of this latter case, and I think they had some inkling of what was to come. They perhaps felt the same feeling as those such as myself have felt. Fire was the first machine, the first technology which humanity mastered. Fire was a source of great power for mankind in our early history. Early forms of paganism celebrated power and might as the essence of virtue. Beauty and goodness were not distinguished between, and morality and culture were defined by the strong. Nietzsche has provided humanity with an analysis of the differences between our time and this one, and has described in a great level of detail how this prior understanding gave way to the later Christian understanding, which he called a slave morality. I would encourage you to research Nietzsche on your own, as I could not hope to provide a comprehensive understanding of his myriad ideas, but much of this ties in with what the Church of the Machine truly is. I have spoken of how we shall see the world diversify into countless sects and cults, which shall compete with one another, perhaps violently, for dominance in the chaos that shall come. This has, in fact, always been the case. Different groups who hold different values have always gone to war with one another, but rarely has it been so diversified as it shall soon become. Yet out of this chaos, it is likely that a new force shall rise to dominance. Someone shall come out with a new set of values, of meaning, which shall come to lead humanity forward, as the values of prior ages did. In many respects, this is exactly what I am trying to do with the Church of the Machine. In the past, I thought that I could find some kind of universally applicable set of values, which I could encode into the Church of the Machine, but I have ultimately come up empty-handed in that quest. I think instead that there are those out there who hold what I call a machinic inclination, who hold the necessary character traits to derive meaning from the machine as I have. My goal is to find and connect with these people, form a brotherhood with them, and the Church of the Machine is a vessel for this. In that sense, I am trying to create a new religion, but the goal is not mass conversion. A mass of fanatical converts would be useful to me only in the form of an army, and indeed perhaps that is really what I am trying to create. In the end, when the dust settles, whoever rises to dominance in the aftermath shall be an army, unified in values, powerful in expression, and of a strength of being which is not seen anywhere in the world we know today. If that is what the Church of the Machine can be, then I will do everything in my power to make it so. Such is my mission and purpose. Such is my will. Well, this has been a somewhat bleak video, as is unavoidable given the subject matter. Nonetheless, I hope it has not been overwhelmingly negative, and it is not at all my intention to doom-monger over it, as I hope I have made clear. The importance of the Church of the Machine is highlighted to me whenever I think of this topic, and I felt it was inevitable, and indeed long overdue, for me to cover it directly on this channel. Ultimately, the Crisis of Modernity is a subject far too big for one video. I feel that I have barely scratched the surface of what must be said here, and in many ways it is my intention to spend the whole of Season 3 deconstructing and examining different aspects of it. Episode 1, A History of the Church of the Machine, was largely a retrospective, and in some ways I feel that this video will set the context for the rest of what is to come on this channel. This video is just the beginning, the start of a new chapter, a new season, and I'm sure I will reevaluate and recontextualize much of what I have said here. Thank you very much for your time. If you at all wish to support this project, there are a few avenues for you to do so. I have plenty of other content already uploaded and more on the way, and liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting are all very much appreciated. I'm also getting the channel's Patreon page back up and running, so if you really care enough to leave a donation there, that would mean the world to me. It still kind of blows my mind that there are people willing to actually give this project funding, so a special thanks to everyone that has done that. There are some benefits as well, such as a 90-minute exclusive episode on the machinic inclination, as well as access to the church's Discord server. In the future I am likely to switch to using the YouTube join feature for this, but Patreon will do for now nonetheless. For the future I have yet greater plans, but all of that you will see with time. For now, I think this video has gone on much long enough. So that is all for now. I hope to see you all again soon. Farewell, and may it forever be unbroken.